Alright, so here we go with part 2. Heard the first part back. Sounded like I was about to play smooth jazz over my voice. Tried to sound so smooth. Oh, it's so good. But anyway, we'll move beyond that. So as I said, we're going to be talking about some of the fighters, a little more particularly, that are coming up this weekend and some of their fights. Like I said, Jesse Vargas is going to be fighting Anton Novikov. He's going to be defending, I believe he has 2 titles that he won from Khabib Alekverdiev, which is a very long name, but nonetheless he's won both titles, I believe, from him, and he's going to be defending them against Anton Novikov. Vargas is in a weird spot, in a sense. He has a couple of fights he has to get through, and if he's able to do it, he has quite a bit of attractive options at his disposal. He signed with Top Rank, so we have to assume he's going to be sort of, getting opponents from that pool, if you will. And so he has guys like, in the immediate future, a fight with, say, Mike Alvarado or Jose Benavidez, or those sort of fights are right there available for him. However, he has to get through the mandatory of Novikov, and I believe he has a contractual rematch with Alekverdiev. The first fight with Alekverdiev, he fought perfectly. He used a very well-placed jab. He was assertive. He took control of the fight. He, in my opinion, clearly won the fight. It's exactly what he needs to do again in the rematch. Of course, at this point, Alekverdiev will now have the Novikov fight to examine, and will have the experience of the first fight, so he'll have to do it again. And a lot of times, rematches go one of 2 ways. They're completely different, or the guy that wins in the same sort of fashion, but just in quicker time. It's never, it's just the exact same fight as it was the first time. It's very rare. Manny Pacquiao and Juan Manuel Marquez are the exceptions, of course, to this rule. That's not what normally happens. It's usually something completely different. So, he has to be careful of overthinking Alekverdiev when that time comes, but he also has to get past Novikov when he's, one of those guys. Nothing to lose, everything to win, so I'm certain going to come out with everything he has, and he has to even get past him, and that could be difficult as well. But if he's able to push through those fights, if he's able to win, he stays undefeated, he has gold around his waist, he's very young, he's an attractive Mexican-American fighter, he has every opportunity to do a lot of big things in the coming year. Again, the Alvarado fight, the Benavidez fight, those are fights that are makeable. And he's, winnable is not what we're talking about here. They're makeable. Those are fights that he could potentially have. He just has to get through this tricky stretch, if you will. And, of course, beyond those fighters, he could have, perhaps Marquez or Pacquiao if he's willing to move up at some point. They're always looking for a Mexican name to put up against those two. It just sells well. You can't really blame them. And, of course, if Crawford is willing to move up, there's that fight that's potentially there. But it would be probably a harder fight, actually, to make because they're both kind of young fighters. You want to match them carefully. You don't want to have to, risk one to benefit the other. You want to help both of them, obviously, as a promoter, so it would be a little trickier. But it's there at the very least. He has a lot of different options, is my point. Just has to get through this weekend, and then probably later this year with the Alekverdiev rematch. So, very interesting time in Vargas' career, obviously. Again, also fighting, the same place would be Rios and Chaves. Brandon Rios and Diego Chaves, to be more exact. They're going to be fighting at the Cosmopolitan of Las Vegas in, you guessed it, Las Vegas. And Rios recently said that this fight is a do-or-die fight for him. And he's right. I mean, it's a, as everyone says, it's a cruel sport. And you can only be an exciting fighter that gets paid A-side money and loses for so long. That's just not the way it works. You have to get some wins, and you have to get them against guys that have a chance of winning as well. And Rios, to his credit, obviously, was the first person to beat Alvarado. He stopped him, and it was a great fight, and it really obviously bolstered his career. But then he lost the rematch, and that doesn't exactly negate the accomplishment, but at the same time, the last thing you remember about their rivalry is that Alvarado adjusted and won. And following that loss, he fought in the biggest fight of his career, was against Manny Pacquiao, and he didn't win a single round. So the 2 things you remember most recently about Brandon Rios is that he couldn't deal with effectively one adjustment that Alvarado made, which was to simply jab and box more. Which is, it's almost hard to even call that an adjustment. That's just what you should do against a brawler like Rios. And so you remember that he couldn't make that second adjustment himself against Alvarado in the rematch. And the second thing you remember about him is that Pacquiao boxed circles around him. I mean, made it seem as if it was honestly not a fair fight. And those are the two things you remember about him. If he loses to Diego Chaves, someone that is tough, that is durable, that can bang, but is brought in to make Rios look good and win, if he cannot beat Chaves, he is in a bit of trouble when it comes to his career. There's just no other way to cut it. That's the fact. If he can win, he's exciting enough. That win, another little decent win here or there, that gives him plenty of time to be just the exciting fighter that win or lose you're going to pay to see. If he loses his third fight in a row, all of a sudden, you have to question his validity as a top flight welterweight, because it's unlikely he's going to be able to make 140 ever again, and it's unlikely that a move up to 154 would benefit him. So 147 is where he's going to be, and you have to assume he has to win these sort of fights. If you're, Team Rios. If you're Team Rios, that's what you have to believe, that he has the ability to do this. And Chaves is one of those guys. He's a very dangerous guy. He's not as crude as, say, Lucas Matisse or Marcos Maidana when it comes to his sort of Argentine punching style. Apparently everyone in Argentina can punch. He's not exactly as crude, though. He can box a little bit more. He has a little bit better of a defense. And he gave a very good young fighter in Keith Thurman a very good fight for, I would say, 6-7 rounds, where it was tough. Thurman was winning, but it was tough. And at the same time, he's not someone that's brought in as this glittering star that has to look good. He'll look ugly if he needs to. So he can make it a nice, clean enough fight for a banger. I mean, let's face facts, he is by nature a banger. But he can make it look clean if he needs to. But if it needs to be ugly, he can make it that way too. He doesn't have to worry about how it's going to look. He just needs to win. If he loses, he'll be in another one of these fights. He'll be brought in as a guy who's mostly a winner, who can give you a hell of a punch, hell of a fight. And if he loses, okay, we'll bring him in for the next welterweight that we need to test. The next welterweight that needs a tough fight, but not too tough a fight. We can bring him in for that. So he'll get another shot. So he's, again, in one of those situations where it's win-win. As long as he doesn't get thoroughly embarrassed, it's win-win for him. And because he can bang a little bit, I would assume Rios is going to be respectful enough of his power that it's not going to be just a quick night of work for either of them. They're going to have to probably lay a little bit of hurt on each other before one of them decides, all right, I've had enough, and the fight ends. So it's a very tricky fight for Rios, but it is the sort of fight he needs. If he cannot win this fight, it's very difficult to see promoters, networks, fans investing too much more in the guy. The guy, he's a very exciting fighter, but that also gives people reason to feel like, if he's losing these fights, the punishment's not worth it. Why do we want to see someone just continuously lose and get beaten up in fights? You just don't want to see that. So looking out for Rios will definitely be very interesting. And for Chaves as well, because he is an exciting fighter. I don't mean to write him off or make it sound like I'm writing him off, but obviously he is what people would consider the B side of this equation. So, and then of course the other two fights that sort of interest me, you have Lucas Browne taking over Andrei Rudikov, and you have or Rudenko, I'm sorry, and then you have Sergey Kovalev taking on Blake Caparelli. Both very interesting fights. For Kovalev with the win, the fights that seem makeable perhaps would be the Jean-Pascal fight or the Jürgen Bremer fight. Hopkins-Stevenson is just going to be tricky for a while. It's something that unfortunately as fans we have to accept. But at the very least it keeps those fights alive with a good win. A loss, I mean, it would give every fighter that's avoiding him all the more reason to avoid him. He's no longer undefeated. He doesn't seem unbeatable. He doesn't have a title. It would be the perfect excuse to not fight the guy, which would be really unfortunate before we, for that to happen before we get to see the fights we most want to see. But, the Pascal fight, the Bremer fight, those are perhaps makeable. I don't know exactly the ins and outs of that. Obviously, no one does unless you're on the inside, but they're there perhaps. At the very least, it keeps all of these things alive is the point. And for Browne, the heavyweight division let's put it this way, right underneath Vladimir Klitschko, the heavyweight division is very interesting. You have Stavern versus Wilder coming up. You have Jennings, who just beat Perez. You have Brown, Price, Fury, Hay potentially coming back. You have those sort of things that keep it very interesting. And Brown taking on virtually any of those guys could be an interesting fight. And again, as long as he successfully defends his Commonwealth title against Rudenko, it's a very wide open field. I'm not saying any of those fights necessarily get made, but they have a chance. He just has to make sure that he wins. So those are the fights that seem to interest me the most this weekend. Very excited to see all of those fights. Hopefully they live up to expectations. Hopefully we get some good results. Nothing controversial. Good luck with that. But nonetheless, it'll be pretty interesting. Also on the Cosmopolitan undercard, we're going to see Saul Rodriguez. We're going to see Shane Mosley Jr. and we'll see Jesse Magdaleno. So those could be pretty interesting fights. I don't think they're going to be on the television, but you will be able to hear about what happens there, obviously, and we'll, of course, give you all of that information on 12rounder.com. So make sure to check that out, by the way. But anyway, when we come back for part 3, I'm just going to be wrapping up. Again, giving you a bit of my take on some of the headlines that we've had over the last week or so. So make sure to click over to that.